Thank you all for coming along today. Just a couple of quick introductions first. My name is David. I'm part of the SDR team here at OpenSensors. This means I work alongside prospective clients, helping to understand their needs and then guiding them towards potential solutions. I'll be assisting today with the session, which will be led by our CEO and founder, Yodit Stanton. Yodit's basically the brains behind the whole operation. Her background is as a developer, and she has a wealth of experience building large-scale data systems across various sectors and has played a key role in leading development teams to run critical trading and machine learning infrastructure for FTSE 500 companies such as Deutsche Bank, Man Investments, and Lehman Brothers. Today's session will largely be focused on the various occupancy sensors that are available on the market. OpenSensors, we understand that organizations face unique challenges when it comes to their space. So we'll be exploring the ways in which these sensors work, also touching on their relevant use cases and then the strategic decisions that this data can be used to leverage. So without further ado, over to you, Yodit.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time today. Just to go through the high-level overview of what we'll cover, we see a lot of people asking about the nuances of sensors, and we want to kind of tie the use cases to what type of sensors that people should really be looking at. I think occupancy sensors gets a very generic term, but there is a lot of nuance between the capacities of different types of sensing technologies. And just to kind of step back a bit, the key priorities that most people are trying to balance, the common ones are obviously kind of getting the most out of the real estate, so cost effectiveness, and also meeting the operational needs of the business, which means balancing the needs of the employees and leveraging productivity and so forth. But I think there's other fundamental factors that are sort of second order benefits. Many companies are focused on obviously reduction of carbon footprint and sustainability, and focusing on the building optimization versus investing in more buildings is a huge kind of impact on sustainability, much more than any kind of energy savings that you can make in an iterative way. The other driver that we see a lot is flexible working and the adoption of activity-based working. I think flexible working is becoming a basic expectation for most employees these days. I mean, and organizations have to adopt or at least evolve the way they treat the real estate when it's no longer a one-to-one, one person, one desk scenario. You have to create spaces that really meet kind of the more modern worker, which is more mobile, wants to work from home, or want to work from different sites and client sites, as well as when they're in the office, have recognized that there are different ways of working. I think it's a given that data is integral to a lot of these decision makings, and it's a necessity. People for a long time have been using manual survey data, so people walking around with clipboards. Many of you either have used them or are familiar with them, counting and that data has been used in workplace strategy. Obviously, it has a lot of shortfalls, I would say. It's much shorter, so over a 2-week period, you get kind of hourly gathering, and a lot of these data sets are now coming from much more automated ways of gathering data, sensors especially. The benefits are obviously it gives you continuous data, and you get over a longer period. I mean, it's just not feasible to have people gathering manual survey data over months, obviously. So with sensors, it's much easier, and you get to see the trends and the patterns much more clearly. A small caveat in terms of occupancy sensors, within our company, we have a policy that we monitor assets, not people. So assets being desks, meeting rooms, phone booths. We don't monitor personally identifiable information, so we will not be covering anything to do with either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, Bluetooth running on people's devices or anything like that. It has huge privacy implications, and whilst we're not judgmental about companies that choose to do it that way, it's not the way we do it. So as we talk about these technologies, please be aware that at least from our side, this is where we stand on the issue. Let's cover the first hypersensor. This is the most common. Most of you are aware of PIR sensors. There's a lot of talk of PIR sensors in the industry. I just want to point out that these types of PIR sensors, whilst they're the same as your normal kind of motion and heat sensor that you might have already in your offices, so these sensors would be triggering for lighting systems or security systems within your offices and your homes. Desk and phone booth PIR sensors are designed differently mechanically, as well as from a kind of a code perspective, because it has to cover a much narrower angle. Desks, for example, the kind of the sizing is between 1,000 and 1,400, and PIRs are angled to ensure that they don't capture the person on next desk, or that somebody walking behind the desk, or even the legs of the person on the other side of the desk. So when we talk about PIR sensors, accuracy is hugely important. So not all sensors that you can just find on Alibaba or anything like that, they wouldn't work. The other thing to be aware of is that we recommend PIR sensors for desks and meeting rooms be battery operated, just because from an operational perspective, it is easier. We have tested in the field, obviously kind of mains powered PIR sensors, but they get unplugged a lot. People want to, let's say, charge their phones and they unplug it and so on. The ones we use, because it's over LoRa, lasts over 2 years in terms of battery life. And obviously, as I mentioned before, no personal data is captured. Now, switching focus from the PIR sensor to the reason, or at least the kind of the output of what you should be looking for. Some quick numbers. We see most companies have an average utilization of around 45 to 55% average desk utilization, which, by implication, a huge chunk of their real estate is suboptimized. In London, per desk, I've seen Cushman & Wakefield say that, that each desk costs around 16,000 to 17,000 pounds a year. We kind of see the desk sensors being a good use case for folks that are having the types of use cases where they're trying to at least optimize the real estate in that way. So let me give you two more tangible examples. Companies with space capacity planning needs. So these could be high growth companies, and they're asking questions about, okay, I've got headcount of these many hundreds of employees over the next year. How do I need to move? Do I have enough real estate and assets? Or companies that are adopting activity-based working. For activity-based working use cases, it's about creating the right amount of work mode, so that matches the different teams and the needs of the different teams. I find activity-based work is quite an interesting shift in the conversation. So the conversation goes from how many desks do I need to how can I create different modes of space that allows better productivity. Each site manager is going to solve their utilization challenges differently, obviously, but the metrics that you look at really help you narrow focus and also get to the root cause of some solutions, or point to some solutions. So one example would be identifying, peak versus off-peak utilization rates. Peak utilization really means that your desk is, what is the number that your desk is used the most at a given point, whether that's per day, per week, or per month. And average utilization tells you the average usage. Balancing the needs of the peaks and averages is obviously key. So if a team, for example, only comes in to the office 1 or 2 days a week because they have an all hands, then the peak will be very high, but the average utilization will be quite low, and so on and so forth. So these metrics really enable you to start digging into the details. In my view, we see a lot of kind of microcultures. So there is no one size fits all data that comes out of most organizations. One building tends to be a sub kind of lots and lots of kind of combinations of behaviors of teams and so on, and being able to dig into, you know, team level and departmental level data is quite important.
We've actually got a couple of relevant questions to those desk PIR sensors.
Sure.
The first one which came in was, will I need a sensor for every desk that I want to measure? So if you'd like to give a couple of sentences on that, and then we'll move on to the second one.
Sure thing. So it depends. It depends on your needs. So if you just want to know the high level utilization number for a floor or a large enough department, we've seen 50% coverage of desks. So for example, maybe every other desk work quite well. That gives you enough of an approximation of the high level numbers. If you need much more granular data, I would say then full coverage is necessary. Especially if you are giving, for example, we haven't covered this yet, but you know, you can give employees like real-time views or screens at each neighborhood to point them to free desks. In that case, you're obviously going to need a sensor at every desk because you need to know the real-time use of all the assets. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it should. The second question that came in was, what generally happens at the end of these sensors' battery life?
The batteries, I mean, quite simply, the batteries get changed. It's lithium batteries. So you would just do a refresh of the site, and depending on the size of the site, that's a fairly simple process. We have a maintenance dashboard that monitors the battery levels on a continuous basis. So we have an early warning system that tells us when batteries need to be refreshed. So we start forecasting and we just do a big bang refresh rather than one by one. So moving on to the next type of sensor, we're going to focus on meeting room presence sensors. And meeting room presence sensors are effectively quite sophisticated PIR. So these are grid-eye PIRs, which means they have more than a number of grid of PIRs. The use case for this is when you need data if somebody's present in a room. They're fixed on ceilings and walls and have quite a high level of focus or wide level of focus. They're again different from a singular PIR because in a singular PIR, somebody walks by it, for example, and it's triggered, just like your lighting system, and that's it. But the grid eyes are designed to constantly monitor for presence. They have a much better accuracy by the field of vision for a room and covers a much more wider area. Again, these are battery operated sensors, and we recommend the presence sensors for smaller meeting rooms. I would say that meeting rooms of 2 to 4 person meeting rooms, you don't necessarily need, you just need the, is it being used? Is it being used regularly? Do I need more of these rooms? And how many hours in the day on average are these meeting rooms being used? You're not necessarily going to make them smaller, so you don't need to know how many people are in there. But essentially what you're trying to do is diagnose the root cause of most complaints, which is, there's not enough meeting rooms. And this could be because, yes, there there are not enough meeting rooms, or people are overbooking the rooms. We see a lot of kind of behavior where people are block booking rooms, never turning up. PAs block booking over months and months and months. So a lot of meeting rooms sitting idle. So it's a really good way of comparing with your booking software and starting to triage the root causes of the problems. You can also understand which meeting rooms are the most popular. So if you look at some of the visualizations here, the presence sensors then tell you, okay, the smaller ones or these size ones on the floor plane on certain parts of the building are used well, others that are tucked away in the back are underutilized, and so on. And so you can start making decisions around either changes of configuration and so forth. You can also, for this one, you can look at the busiest periods, which is always quite handy. The next type of sensor is meeting room counters. These are much more image-based counters. They are mains powered because they're much more energy intensive. So you can connect them to either PoE or mains. They're placed over the doorways, and essentially they're counting the number of people coming into the room and coming out. They're pretty sophisticated, I would say. So we tend to recommend them when you really need to know, well, how many people are in this particular room. So if you have a room of a fairly decently sized room and you want to know, for a 16-person meeting room, are 2 people using it on a regular basis just to have a quick meeting? So that tells you you need more collaborative areas. Just as a side note, I would say that a few people have asked over time, why can't I just use a PIR sensor under each chair or under each desk or sitting area in a meeting room and use that as a proxy for counting how many people are using that particular meeting room? We really don't recommend this approach. I think the accuracy, just from experience, has been pretty dire. I think it's quite tempting to just stick a few sensors under a huge table, but when you think about it, people are sitting quite closely together on your average meeting desk, and it really doesn't work that well to differentiate between individuals. So you're going to have a lot of kind of quite false data. So that is not a recommended way. I know that people do that, and that's fine, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that point. For a lot of these data sets, I think, kind of having less sensors but having highly accurate information trumps having a lot of sensors that are not necessarily kind of fitting the use cases. I think because we're not a hardware company, we can be a bit more nuanced about how about the kind of the types of sensors and really kind of interrogate them. But I've seen cases when these PIRs are deployed and when the data is garbage, there's not really much you can do about it.
So yeah, we've had another question come in which pertains to the last 2 types of sensors, which is, if I need to know presence and count, do I need to use both meeting room sensor types, or is there one that's better than the other?
No, I think it's one or the other. So the counters will tell you it's being used as well as how many people are using it. The presence sensors tells you the usage and the density of usage over time. So one or the other is sufficient. I would say the counters have, let's say, the features of the presence sensors with extra benefits of being able to tell you how many people have been using it over a period. This is kind of the kind of data you get from counters. So you not only get, the kind of the average time that the room has been occupied, but you also start seeing the average occupants. So for this example, you can compare the capacity of this meeting room to its average occupants. And this meeting room is on average used by 3 people. It's a maximum 8-person meeting room. So you can kind of see how, at least internalize how this information is presented. The last type of sensors I'm going to talk about today is footfall counters. Footfall counters, just think of them as very sophisticated meeting room counters in a sense that it allows people to segment a site by zones. And you can really get an understanding of how many people are in specific zones, how many people, what the usage is of, let's say, open and collaborative areas and kitchens and so forth. They're sophisticated in the sense that you can have multiple directional traffic, so it kind of like 4 directional traffic, and you can differentiate between individual counts. So in a corridor, you can see which period people went, and you can keep track of what neighborhoods have the most density in terms of people, not just the desks. Again, the data is anonymized. What you're getting back is individual counts, not personal information. And the reason for this is really kind of getting a very, for people that want to have a clear accuracy of traffic, usage of, we have clients putting footfall counters in canteens, as well as clients that put them in stairs to understand the usage of stairs versus lifts and so forth. So it's a really, like, if you need to understand overall the design of your space and start load balancing, this is a pretty critical piece of data, but it's for those that have quite complex real estate, I would say, if you're looking for redesign opportunities and so forth.
We've just had quite a relevant question come in relating to all of the sensors that we've gone over, which is, how long does it take before I can see any meaningful trends within my data?
You start getting a sense of the trends within 4 to 6 weeks. There is seasonality involved here, so but you'll start seeing the kind of the gist of the shape of utilization, peak utilization, and so forth over that period. Because we recommend a much more iterative approach of change, do a small change, test it, and so forth, you're constantly getting a feedback loop. So you're not necessarily taking kind of a huge amount of data, making a huge amount of change, and then you're done. I think there's a cycle of test and learn that is going to be necessary. But I think initially I would say within the first 6 weeks.
Brilliant, thank you. That makes up the main bulk of our presentation. Just going to summarize a few of the key takeaways which we hope that you'll have gathered from this. The first of which is that when dealing with space, unique challenges require unique solutions. Unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all deployment which will answer all your questions. It's a case of going around building by building, use case by use case, understanding what you need. Following on from this, hardware follows need. So before going into a building and putting sensors around, you really need to know what you're trying to get out of your study and the metrics that you want to actually measure. And then after this, we can start looking, and you can start looking at what hardware is actually best to get those results. Similarly, these solutions are very flexible. So it's not a case of sensor A provides data A, so can only be used for purpose A. Each sensor can be kind of used to answer many questions, even though it's reading the same thing. You can use it in a number of ways, depending on, again, the question that you're actually trying to answer. And lastly, there is sadly, again, no quick fix when it comes to measuring space occupancy. It's just a case of having to put the sensors in and then giving them time to actually gather the meaningful data and making sure that the deployment is answering the questions that you want them to. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A section. We've just had one come in, which is, can you align the floor plans to other space management systems to avoid discrepancies and double effort to update for changes?
Yes, is the very quick answer. So we have fairly robust APIs, and our policy is to be integratable with other systems. We should be able to integrate it if they have APIs. It's on a case-by-case basis because we need to look at the systems in question and really kind of understand the way they work and and hopefully they also have APIs, so it is possible. Unfortunately, I can only answer that after looking at the particular system you're talking about. So I think for most people, we have the emails for if you send it to hello@OpenSensors, I can have a look and give you a quick answer back. But APIs of the other systems is the key driver.
Brilliant. We also had one come in earlier, which I thought would be better to deal with at the end, which relates to what you're talking about at the beginning to do with privacy, which was, do you ever have clients where the employees themselves are resistant to having sensors, even when they're not gathering any other information? And what can we do to get around that problem?
The approach that we personally like is to over communicate. So we have employee communication plan, just like every change in the workplace. I think if you treat it as an introduction of any change process, over communicate, tell people what you're doing, tell them why you're using the data, what you're not going to use the data for, what the end goal should be, because everyone wants a really nice environment to work in. I think the biggest challenge or the biggest problems have been in lack of communication. So over communicating and tell people the benefits. I think especially if you give them extra benefits such as being able to find desks easily, getting rid of the problem points of there's not enough meetings, I can never have a meeting, and so on, and really work with the change champions within the organization. It can go smoothly. When it doesn't go smoothly is when these sensors appear, people don't know what they're for, there's paranoia around, are you monitoring when I'm taking breaks? Are you spying on me? Is HR going to get involved? I mean, all these questions have to be answered, and they have to be answered quite transparently.
Yeah, sounds great. We've also got one which is relating to, I imagine, the desk sensors mostly. Just what is the average person to desk ratio, and is there any sort of benchmark that I should be looking out for in particular?
Person to desk ratio really varies between teams. So I'll give you an example. You might have within one floor, you might have, for example, finance, who are heavy desk users, and for that team, it might make sense to give a 1-to-1 person to desk ratio because they are very, very desk bound. For example, you might have other teams that are highly mobile, such as sales and so forth, that are always on client side, and you can be very aggressive with the person to desk ratio. So you can have kind of 1-to-3, 1-to-4 ratio. What we've also observed, and I think this is published in some of the research, I need to go back and look up the research, is obviously very senior people have much more mobile working patterns. They're in meetings a lot versus more I guess younger grads who are actually more desk bound. So that's an interesting insight that I've observed so far. But there is no pre-canned answer I can give here. Within one building, it will vary highly between each team. And it's the key is to find what is just right for each team and keep them happy.
Brilliant. We've just had, I think we've probably got time for just two more, quite aware of how long we're going on. One is actually just relating to how we as a company would operate with clients, which is, how do we view the data as clients? Is there a dashboard for that?
Yes, there is. So there are a number of views. One is the real-time view, which is an employee-facing view. They're usually put on large screens and entrances and so forth. For the site managers, there is the utilization view, which breaks down by, which are web dashboards. They're all web dashboards that breaks down the data in many ways.
So we've gone over the typical strategic use cases of what these sensors can do, but is there any sort of research or sign of what the effects these changes can have on well-being and productivity in the workplace as well?
Yes, and well-being and productivity are such huge topics. So there's some kind of rules of thumb that we're seeing very often. So in terms of the environment, we have noise sensors, CO2 sensors, and so on. And even within our own office, I think we noticed as we get to peak capacity, the CO2 levels just go through the roof. And high levels of CO2 obviously makes you groggy, and it really makes you kind of very lethargic and not very productive. And as you address, I think some people call it sweat the asset, you really have to be very careful about the impact of that that change on employees. So making sure there's proper ventilation systems. The other kind of I guess data point you should be aware of is Leesman Index did this survey. Noise is one of the most complained about environmental, or actually the most complained about environmental factor. And being very aware that open plan offices get obviously kind of a lot of grief because of this, but being aware within your design process of ensuring that you have noisy areas, and noisy areas are great when people need to chat and need to kind of exchange ideas, but there's also quiet areas and deep focus areas. And so again, when you go back to this activity-based working scenario, you need to start thinking about what are the different modes that each person will need to work in, and how do you cater for that? How do you ensure that you have areas for this? You can't just have deep focus areas because people want to collaborate, but you need to balance it out. So well-being and productivity are huge topics, and I'm not going to do them justice in a couple of minutes here, but we might come back and do another session on it, and some of the sensors that are used in that, if there's enough interest.
Thank you very much to everybody who joined us today. We hope it's been useful and interesting. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.